So once upon a time, allegedly, there was a Fast and Furious arcade game developed by Raw Thrills, and plans were made by Midway to port the game over to home consoles. Somewhere along the way while the game was being developed, Midway lost the rights to the Fast and Furious franchise, so rather than scrap their racing game project, they just changed a few things around and redubbed the game Cruis'n, thus making it the fourth entry in the Cruis'n line of arcade racing games that began with Cruis'n USA in 1994 and reintroduced with Cruis'n Blast a couple of years ago. On a side note, Wikipedia also includes Cruis'n Velocity as part of the Cruis'n canon, but that's a Game Boy Advance game and also kinda shit, so we won't be counting that here. Now, if the title card or the page header or whatever you clicked on didn't give it away, today's subject matter is indeed Cruis'n. Just Cruis'n for this go-around. Released in 2007 for Nintendo Wii in North America, with Europeans getting it a few months later. No Japanese release, surprisingly enough, but then again, they've got their share of exclusive shit we don't get here, so that's fine by me. Couple modes of play here. Circuit is where you race through a series of 12 tracks, and if you place in the top 3, you move on to the next track, and these tracks are eventually unlocked for play in the arcade mode, as well as the 2-player mode. In regards to the actual racing, it's your typical racing fare. You race against other drivers, try not to crash into anything, keyword being try, and finish as fast as possible. Naturally, you want to aim for the top 3, but generally, the higher position you finish, the more prize money you'll end up winning, and winning money is what unlocks more cars that you could play with. Before each race, you're given the option to upgrade your vehicle to improve its overall performance in key areas, and if you place in the top 3, that upgrade sticks, or you could go for the Nitro Pack, which gives you 3 Nitro Bursts that you could use to temporarily boost your speed during a race. Just don't expect anything too deep or realistic because Cruis'n is very much a Cruis'n game. The car physics are sometimes bonkers, there's a lot of hang time here and there for possible flips and dives, you could do some wheelies here and there, that sort of thing. This is an arcade racer that has no qualms about being wild, bonkers, and totally out of touch with reality. And if you're willing to set aside any preconceived notions about how cars are supposed to handle and just go with the absurdity of it all, you've got the right mindset to enjoy a Cruis'n game, but not necessarily this Cruis'n game. Since this is on the Wii, Cruis'n makes use of the Wii Remote, and only the Wii Remote. No classic controller or GameCube controller support for this one. And since this is using the Wii Remote, that means you'll be dabbling in the whole motion control thing that everyone liked back in the day, and it works about as well as you'd expect. However, as a bit of a compromise, you can enable the option to use the D-pad to control steering with that, which works, and choose your sensitivity setting to either loose or tight. Neither of which makes any real difference in the long run because control over your vehicle is extremely loose regardless of which option you play. Honestly, I feel controls in the N64 games were much better than this, and they were fairly loose there as well. Apparently, once you start getting traction upgrades, the control is supposed to improve marginally, which is baffling. The idea that the player needs to grind for several upgrades just so that the game doesn't control like absolute dog shit. Mind you, the later Cruis'n Blast release also had you grinding for upgrades that improved performance, but that game also had fairly solid controls from the get-go. I could even drift in that game without much problem. The only drifting being done in Cruis'n is my patience as I'm trying to find the right tilt to turn here, or avoid that there, or figure out how many taps on the D-pad I need to. Did I mention that even the N64 ports of Cruis'n controlled better than this? Even with that awful controller, I may have neglected to mention that. Graphically speaking, Cruis'n looks adequate. And that's probably the nicest way of putting it. It looks adequate. Some folks like to say that this looks like an up-res PS1 or N64 game, but I'll give Cruis'n a bit more credit than that. This is clearly Dreamcast caliber graphics at play here, with a little more shit the Shinola slapped on for good measure, much like those Sonic Adventure GameCube ports. Anyone remember the Cruis'n games back in the day, where everything resembled a cardboard cutout and the only things polygonal were the cars and the hills? Those look kind of dated these days, but I'm sorry, they still look better than this. I mean, look, the cars look somewhat like cars, the cars are supposed to, somewhat. The tracks look fine for the drab environments they convey. Most of them are at night, they all kind of look the same, and sometimes there's these weird visual glitches and pop-ups that occur, such as an empty void around this corner of Times Square. Occasional bits of clipping that's especially prevalent when you finish a race. My camera likes to focus on your car while it's spinning around and showing off some forbidden space, shall we say. But what really disappointed me was the sound. Cruis'n games usually have these really killer tracks that you can play in the background, nothing too memorable in the long run. Okay, fair enough. Cruis'n's tracks had some bland generic techno pseudo-rock muzak that drones in the background. You have a number of tracks to choose from, none of them stand out, they're just there. Sound effects are fine, cars sound like cars, crashes sound like crashes. You have the checkpoint lady saying checkpoint, the name of the tracks, some other blurbs here and there, didn't really pay attention, couldn't be bothered to stay awake half the time. So in case the past few minutes hasn't already made it readily apparent, I am not a fan of this Cruis'n game. Apparently somebody heard the N64 ports of the old games were bad, and then told everyone to hold their beer, which resulted in this absolute mess of a game that plays worse than those old N64 ports ever did. I want to say that this is the worst Cruis'n game that I've played, but since Cruis'n Velocity on the GBA is apparently part of that canon, fuck knows why, I may as well call this the second worst Cruis'n game I've played, and honestly, I wouldn't bother with this one. The old N64 ports might not be perfect, but they're still playable, and certainly more so than this. And if you want a Cruis'n game that looks shinier and plays better, well, Cruis'n Blast on the Switch is right there. Go play that instead. Avoid this stinker at all costs.